I want to start today with a concept that comes up a lot when you read history. It's called the great man theory.
Right. The idea that history is basically just shaped by the sheer will of specific individuals.
Exactly. You know, you think of Napoleon or Churchill, or maybe in the context of what we're looking at today, someone like Deng Xiaoping.
Sure.
But looking through the massive stack of research we have today for this deep dive, specifically regarding China's huge technological ascent, I'm honestly starting to think we give individuals way too much credit.
And maybe institutions not enough.
Yes, exactly. Because after reading this, my mind is kind of blown.
It's a really fair assessment, honestly. We do tend to focus on the person at the podium because, well, it's just a cleaner narrative.
Right, it's a better story.
Yeah, it's much easier to write a biography of a leader than to write an institutional history.
Yeah.
But if you actually want to understand capacity, like real state capacity and power, you have to look at the engine room.
The engine room.
Right. You have to look at where the talent is actually creating the strategy.
And the engine room we are diving into today, for you guys listening, it isn't a government ministry. And it's not some top secret military laboratory either.
No, it's university.
Yeah. It's Tsinghua University in Beijing. And frankly, just calling it a university feels like a massive understatement based on the materials we have.
It really does.
The sources essentially describe it as the literal architect of the Chinese tech century, like a national engine.
Architect is definitely the right word for it, because Tsinghua isn't just a place where, young adults go to get a degree and hang out on the campus quad.
Right.
Over the last century, it has essentially functioned as a proxy for the Chinese state itself. Its evolution mirrors the country's evolution almost perfectly.
Which is wild to see mapped out.
It is. If you want to understand why China builds high-speed rail the exact way it does, or why it's pushing so incredibly hard into AI right now, you really have to understand the specific culture of this one single school.
And what struck me almost immediately in the reading was this sense of mission. Because this isn't just about education in the traditional, liberal arts sense that we might think of.
Well, no, not at all.
The sources paint a picture of an institution that is actively designed for national technological independence. But the path they took to get there is, it's incredibly nonlinear.
It's full of contradictions. And
Yeah.
honestly, that's exactly what makes it such a fascinating case study for us to unpack.
Yeah.
You have this school that starts out as literally a tool of foreign influence, and then it morphs into a Soviet-style engineering boot camp, and then it pivots completely again to become this massive rival to Silicon Valley.
Okay, let's actually start with that origin story, because I feel like if you wrote this in a movie script, people would just say it's too on the nose.
It really is.
So we are going all the way back to 1911. The Qing dynasty is basically collapsing, and Tsinghua is founded. But the funding model, this is the part that I think is going to surprise most of you listening who haven't looked into this before.
He usually does.
Because it wasn't funded by the emperor or the Chinese government. It was funded by the United States.
Right. And to be really specific, it was funded by the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship.
Which sounds intense.
It was. Just to give a little context for the listeners, after the Boxer Rebellion, which was this very violent anti-foreign uprising in China, the Western powers slapped China with these absolutely massive reparations.
Right. They called them indemnities.
Yeah. And we are talking about a totally crippling amount of silver that China was forced to pay.
It was a huge national humiliation.
Yeah.
But then United States, under Theodore Roosevelt at the time, they make this very strategic pivot.
They did.
They realized the reparations were basically excessive, and frankly, they saw an opportunity for what we would now probably call soft power.
Exactly. Roosevelt's administration decided to actually remit a portion of that money back to China.
But with major strings attached.
Very specific strings. The condition was that the funds had to be used exclusively to prepare Chinese students to go study at American universities.
So literally the whole thing, Tsinghua, was built as a preparatory school for America.
Yes.
I was looking at the notes on their early curriculum, and it was modeled almost entirely on the American system, like full English immersion, Western sciences. They even played American sports.
They did. It was designed to actively bridge the gap between this older feudal education system and places like Cornell or MIT.
It was explicitly called a bridge to the West.
Right. And the logic from the American side was extremely clear. If you educate the future leaders of China in American values and American science, you essentially secure a long-term ally.
Makes total sense strategically.
It does. And from the Chinese side, even though the source of the money was deeply humiliating, The pragmatism of it is undeniable.
Right, they needed the knowledge.
Exactly. They needed the modern science and engineering.
And that irony is just palpable throughout all the sources we have today. This institution that was created to export China's best minds to the West is now the primary engine competing with the West.
It is the ultimate long game reversal.
It really is. But the Tsinghua of 1911, that sort of liberal arts, American-style prep school, that is definitely not the Tsinghua that dominates global tech today.
No, not even close. To get to that modern version, we really have to look at the massive fracture that happened in the mid-20th century.
Right. So we move forward to the 1949 revolution and then the big reorganization in 1952. The Communist Party takes power, they look at the whole university system, and they basically decide it's all wrong for their goals.
Yeah, the notes describe this period as a Soviet-style restructuring.
And restructuring seems like putting it mildly, honestly.
It really is mildly put. It was a complete and total dismantling of the comprehensive university model.
Right.
Because in the U.S. or Europe, we tend to value the university as this universe of broad knowledge, right? You have literature right next to physics and philosophy next to biology.
Yeah, the whole well-rounded citizen idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the 1952 reforms in China just said, we do not need that. We need specialists.
I was looking at the list of departments that were just cut or transferred out of Tsinghua entirely during this time, and it is staggering. Sociology, gone.
Law is gone.
Yeah, law is gone. The humanities were essentially just stripped away overnight.
Because in the eyes of the State Planning Committee at that time, those specific disciplines just weren't productive for the immediate survival needs of the nation.
Right.
You really have to remember the context here. This was a country that needed to industrialize basically overnight.
Yeah.
They didn't need people sitting around debating the ethics of industrialization.
Yeah.
They needed people who could actually mix the concrete, build the dams, and wire the electrical grid.
So Tsinghua just becomes this pure, concentrated engineering powerhouse. And this is where that concept of the red engineer comes from in our reading, right?
Correct. The red engineer was the absolute ideal citizen of that era.
Because they were politically loyal, which is the red part, and technically proficient, the engineer part.
Exactly. And Tsinghua became the absolute epicenter of this mindset. It wasn't just about learning math formulas. It was about learning how to literally build the physical infrastructure of a new modern state.
Which is fascinating. And this brings us to a part of the research that I think explains so much about modern China today. It's the rise of the technocrats.
Yes, this is a huge point.
Because these engineers, they didn't just stay in the tractor factories or the design bureaus. Eventually, they moved directly into government politics.
And this is a really crucial distinction between the political cultures of, say, the United States and China.
Right.
In the U.S., the traditional path to political power is usually through law. You study law, you understand argumentation, you focus on rights and precedent, you learn how to adjudicate conflict between parties.
Right. It's all about navigating the rules of the game. You're trying to win an argument. Whereas the engineering mindset, specifically the kind they were cultivating at Tsinghua during this period, is completely different.
It's totally different. It is entirely about systems.
Systems and scale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because an engineer doesn't look for a legal precedent when they face a problem. They look for the most efficient solution to a capacity issue.
Right. Their brain goes to, okay, we have X amount of resources, we need Y output. What is the optimal process to get there?
Exactly. And when you take that specific logic and you apply it to governing a nation, you get a very specific, unique style of leadership.
The sources mention the Tsinghua clique in politics, and the numbers here are just wild. At one point, specifically under the Hu Jintao administration, and he was a hydraulic engineer from Tsinghua himself, right?
Yes, he was.
Literally every single member of the Politburo Standing Committee had an engineering background. Every single one.
It was a level of dominance that is honestly hard to overstate.
Yeah.
And even the current leader, Xi Jinping, is a chemical engineering graduate from Tsinghua.
Right.
Now, obviously, we have to note that political ideology plays a massive role in all of this. We certainly can't ignore that. But the underlying framework for problem solving often defaults back to this strict engineering logic.
Which explains the absolute obsession with infrastructure we see.
Exactly. It explains so much of it.
Because if your leaders are trained to build massive dams and power grids, they view the entire nation as just one giant engineering project.
Right. Where a lawyer might look at building a massive high-speed rail network and see a tangled bundle of land rights issues and environmental lawsuits and funding liabilities.
Yeah, a nightmare, basically.
Right. But a Tsinghua technocrat looks at that exact same rail network and just sees a flow efficiency problem. a problem that can be solved with enough concrete, steel, and planning.
And they actually have the technical training to execute it at that kind of massive scale.
They do. That is the direct legacy of that 1952 pivot towards specialized engineering.
But, and this is the next big pivot we need to get into, if Tsinghua had just stayed a school for building concrete dams, it wouldn't be the global tech giant that we're talking about today.
No, it would be a complete relic.
Right. Because the world changed again. We move into the reform era under Deng Xiaoping in the late 70s and 80s. The economy starts opening up to the world, and suddenly just pouring concrete isn't going to cut it anymore.
No. Suddenly you need computers, you need modern finance, you need business management.
And this had to be a pretty perilous moment for the university, right? Because institutions are usually pretty stubborn things. A faculty full of civil and hydraulic engineers doesn't necessarily just want to pivot to computer science and economics overnight.
It was a very tricky transition.
Yeah.
But the leadership at Tsinghua realized that if they wanted to remain the national engine, they had to upgrade their software, so to speak.
I found the establishment of their School of Economics and Management really interesting in the notes here. They brought in Zhu Rongji, who was a Tsinghua alumni and who later actually became the premier of China, to be the founding dean of that specific school.
Right.
Which really signals that they took this pivot to modern economics just as seriously as the engineering one.
They did. And they did something else during this period that really harkens back to their origins in 1911. They started looking outward again.
Sending people to the West.
Exactly. They started sending their scholars abroad. They started actively welcoming Western experts to campus. And they worked really hard to reintegrate with the global scientific community.
But the sources are careful to point out, this time it wasn't about subservience to the West. It was entirely about playing catch-up.
Catch up and eventually surpass. And this really leads us to the geographical aspect of the story, which is crucial. We really can't talk about Tsinghua's modern digital evolution without talking about Zhongguancun.
Right. The notes keep comparing Zhongguancun to Silicon Valley, with Tsinghua basically playing the role of Stanford in that analogy.
The comparison is definitely apt, but the actual integration in Beijing is much, much tighter than in California.
How so?
Well, in the U.S., the relationship between Stanford and Silicon Valley is largely organic. It's driven by market forces, private venture capital, individual entrepreneurs.
Right, people just kind of starting companies in their garages.
Exactly. But in Beijing, the relationship between Tsinghua University and the tech hub of Zhongguancun, right outside its gates, is much more curated.
Curated by the state, you mean?
Curated by what the sources call an iron triangle.
Okay, the Iron Triangle.
Right. It's the extremely tight integration of academia, industry, and government policy. Because so many top government officials are Tsinghua alumni, and the university itself is a state asset, and the massive tech companies are often strategic national champions, the walls between these three areas are highly porous.
So they aren't working in silos at all.
Not at all. You have professors who are founding key companies. You have government officials who are shaping national research grants to fit very specific industrial needs. And you have those same companies directly funding the university labs.
It's just a massive continuous feedback loop. And I suppose that is where this digital evolution really takes off. It's not just about teaching computer science 101 to undergrads. It's about the university functioning as a deliberate incubator for the exact technologies the state decides are critical for the future.
Precisely. And that brings us directly to their current status today. If you look at where Tsinghua is aggressively deploying its resources and talent right now, it reads like a checklist of the most contested technologies on the planet.
Yeah, looking at the list here. Artificial intelligence, advanced semiconductors, 5G telecommunications, cutting-edge biotech.
Right. And notice what all of those specific fields have in common. They are all what we call dual-use technologies.
Meaning military and civilian.
Exactly. They have immense commercial and economic value, obviously, but they are also absolutely critical for national security and defense. And this is where that core concept of national technological independence really comes to the forefront.
That phrase really stood out to me in the reading, too, because it clarifies that this isn't just about innovation for the sake of making better consumer products or higher profits. It's about ensuring they are not reliant on anyone else's supply chain.
Correct. The lesson that China has taken from all the recent geopolitical tensions, the chip bans, the trade wars, the tariffs, is that reliance on Western technology is a fundamental national vulnerability.
So Tsinhua's mandate has effectively shifted again. It went from catch up to the West to create a completely independent ecosystem.
Yes, they need to build it all in-house.
I noticed in the research that Tsinghua has been heavily investing in its own semiconductor research capabilities, specifically trying to find ways to bypass the traditional lithography techniques that Western companies currently dominate. That seems like a direct response to those exact external pressures.
It absolutely is, and it's important to remember it's not just about building the hardware. It's about building the talent pipeline to invent the next generation of hardware.
Right.
They are aggressively recruiting top-tier researchers to come work at Tsinghua. And many of these are Chinese nationals who originally studied or worked for years in the United States. They actually have a name for them. They call them sea turtles.
Sea turtles. I actually love that term because they swim across the ocean, gather experience, and then return to the beach where they started.
Exactly. But it really highlights that vital human capital element. You can buy the most expensive lab equipment in the world, but you still have to grow the brains that operate it.
And this is where the Tsinghua model feels so distinct from the traditional Western ivory tower model of higher education.
Very distinct.
Because in the West, we generally believe universities should be somewhat independent from the state. There should be independent critics of power, places of pure, unconstrained research. Like, there is a very deliberate distance between the Pentagon and the humanities department at a place like Yale or Princeton.
Right. Whereas at Tsinghua, the source material makes it very clear that the university is proudly, explicitly part of the national team.
The national team.
Yes. And it is incredibly meritocratic. It is wildly hard to get accepted into Tsinghua. Arguably, given the sheer size of the population, it's harder than getting into Harvard.
Right.
So they have the absolute smartest people in the country.
Right.
But the entire system is carefully designed to channel that individual brilliance directly into national objectives. The sources call it a factory for strategy.
A factory for strategy. That phrase just really sticks with me because it implies that the university isn't just sitting back and reacting to the world. It is actively trying to shape the future of the world.
That is.
But I do want to push back on one thing here, or at least ask a question that the notes definitely hint at. Is there a downside to this hyper-technocratic engineering-first model?
Yeah. That is the big question. Because when you view absolutely everything as an engineering problem, you naturally tend to undervalue the things that don't neatly fit into a spreadsheet.
Right.
Things like cultural nuance, individual rights, or just the general messiness and unpredictability of human behavior. Engineering logic always strives for ultimate efficiency and perfect order. But human societies are inherently messy.
And innovation itself, like true 0-to-1 paradigm-shifting innovation, that's often really messy, too.
Literally true.
It usually comes from weirdos and dropouts and people who completely challenge the established system. It doesn't necessarily always come from the people who got the perfect score on the state entrance exam and perfectly followed the 5-year plan.
And that is the central tension of all of this. Can a state-directed, hyper-organized, top-down system like Tsinghua consistently out-innovate the chaotic, market-driven, bottom-up chaos of the American university system? That is literally the defining contest of the 21st century.
It's basically structure versus chaos.
In a way, yes. Tsinghua is making a massive bet that in a world of incredibly complex, resource-heavy technologies, things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, fusion energy, you actually need structure.
Because it's too expensive for two guys in a garage.
Exactly. You need massive, coordinated, sustained investment that really only a state-backed player can provide.
So bringing this all the way back to the mission we started with today, we have this single institution that started on the American dime, completely adopted a Soviet structure, and is now actively defining the modern Chinese tech model. It really forces you to rethink what a university is actually for.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
We naturally tend to think of universities as these static, quiet backdrops to history.
Yeah.
But the Tsinghua story shows that they are highly active participants in history. They can be weapons of soft power, they can be tools of rapid industrialization, or they can be the literal engines of global geopolitical rivalry.
It reminds me of that final thought from our source material today, the one about the fundamental nature of competition.
Right. The sources pose this idea that when a nation views technology as its ultimate destiny, it doesn't just build factories to build the widgets.
Right. It builds universities that function like factories for leadership and strategy. That's the quote. And it suggests that the most dangerous weapon in the long run isn't a missile silo.
It's a curriculum.
A curriculum.
Because the curriculum determines exactly how the next generation is going to solve problems. If you teach them to value systemic efficiency and national strength above all else, that is exactly the world they are going to build. but if you teach them critical thinking and open debate, they build a completely different world.
Wow. It is just such a fascinating lens to view the news through. I feel like next time any of you listening see a headline about a major breakthrough in Chinese quantum computing or some massive new infrastructure project, we shouldn't just be looking at the politician cutting the ribbon.
No, we should
Or,
really be looking at the vast alumni network standing quietly behind him.
and the century of history that built the school, that trained them in the first place. We like to leave you with a final thought to mull over. And looking at all of this, it makes me wonder, if the battleground of the 21st century is the classroom, how well are our own institutions actually adapted for that kind of long-term strategic fight?
Hmm.
Are we still running a 20th century playbook while others are building these massive factories for strategy?
It's a very sobering question.
It really is. Well, it's been a truly illuminating dive into the machinery behind the headlines today.
It's always the quiet engines that end up driving the ship.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for breaking all of this down with me. And to everyone listening, thanks for giving us your time today. Keep questioning the things in the background, and we'll see you on the next one.